Hello and welcome to another episode of I Remember the Inland Empire. I'm Chuck Street. I'll be your host for today's program. And today's focus is going to be about a part of Inland Empire history that a lot of people don't know about, or if they do know about it, they forgot about it. We're going to talk about Camp Ono. Now, Camp Ono was a prisoner of war camp that was in existence for just a few years, 3 or 4 years. And it was situated near what today is Cal State San Bernardino. And to be even more specific, the border of the camp was near Kendall Drive and Palm Street up towards DeVore. And during World War II, they had almost 500 prisoners there. They were all Italians, and they were captured in North Africa and then brought over here to the United States. And they resided at Camp Ono. Now, today we're especially delighted to have with us two guys who were the sons of former Camp Ono detainees. So with us today is Perry Pugno and also Tom Giudici. And again, their fathers were detainees at Camp Ono. And their stories, I guarantee you, are just fascinating about, what happened with them after they got here and how they ended up coming back and marrying people and establishing thriving businesses here in the Inland Empire. So Perry, did I describe Camp Ono accurately?
Yeah, you did. That's right where it was.
And then Tom, anything I left out there?
No, it's bordered by what is today Kendall. I don't know if they still call it Kendall Drive, and the freeway. That was basically, it sat between Kendall and what is now the freeway today. But you're right; it's right off of State College Drive there as well. Correct.
Right. I actually drove by there a couple of days ago. I was up in that area, and Palm Avenue is one of the off ramps from the I-215 freeway, and the border of Camp Ono is probably about 300 yards to the east of the freeway, right there. It's still called Kendall Drive. And what's so interesting, if you look at photographs from the camp days, it was pretty wide open, and there were just these very austere kind of buildings in that location. But today there's retail strip centers there. There's gas stations, and there's a lot of residential tract homes. So how things have changed over the years. So Tom, perhaps you could tell us, your father was in the Italian military. I think it was the Air Force, right? And he was involved in a campaign in North Africa, and he was captured. So talk briefly about your dad and what he was doing in World War II.
Sure, that's correct. My dad was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in North Africa. Long story short, he drove a supply truck. And if you're familiar with the North African campaign, whether it be from the Allies or the Axis, they would outrun their supply lines and get pushed back and forth pretty frequently. So the supply was critical. The supply lines were critical. Make a long story short, I'm going to say around 1942 or 1943, he was captured by Patton's Second Corps, and at that time effectively ended his war, of course. But from that point in 42, 43, he and the others were loaded on troop ships that were going back empty, because they were supplying the troops in that theater, and so they were sending the prisoners back to the U.S. to work in the fields, or to work, not so much to support the war effort, but they were to work in the fields and agriculture and so forth. So that pretty much ended his war, was when he was captured by Patton. And basically they moved by ship from North Africa to New York, and then from New York they were moved by trains. His first stop before he got to Camp Ono was in Yuma. They spent some time in Yuma working the fields down there, and then he ultimately was interned in Camp Ono there in San Bernardino. And I'm going to say that was probably around 1943, right in that general time period.
Now, Perry, what about your father? He was obviously in the Italian military. Which branch?
He was in the Air Force also. He was an aircraft mechanic at that point. Um, and the capture story is they were camped just outside of Tripoli. And on January 29th, 1943, they got word that the British were coming. And so their sergeant had been in the city. And so a couple of them jumped in a Jeep and they drove into the city to notify their sergeant that the British were coming. And they picked up their sergeant and they turned around. And as they were leaving the city, approaching one of the city gates, a British tank was coming the other direction toward them. So they stopped and put their hands up and were captured. They were held by the British apparently for several days before they were turned over to the Americans. And once they were turned over to the Americans, they were moved along the north rim of Africa through Algeria to Casablanca. And from Casablanca, they were sent to Norfolk, Virginia. And they arrived in Norfolk the end of May 1943. And they were sent to Arizona also. They were sent to Camp Florence in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, along with about 25,000 other prisoners from Italy and Germany. Dad used to say you could tell which prisoners were which because the German prisoners were marching and exercising and the Italian prisoners were playing cards. They were sent from there to Guasti, Cucamonga, to help out in the fields. Dad really, really hated picking grapes. And because he had some trade skills, ended up doing electrical and plumbing work there in Guasti during the time they were there. And which was good because it was really hot that summer in Guasti. And then in February of 44 is when that group of prisoners, and I think there were probably about 50 to 100 of them at that point, they were transferred to Camp Ono in February of 44. And he says those were some of the best years of his life there at Camp Ono.
Well, I'm sure that when he was captured, and Tom, you probably will agree with this, when they were captured, they thought that was the worst day of their life. They didn't know what their future was going to be and how they were going to be treated. And they end up in the Inland Empire in a prisoner of war camp. And then Perry, your dad was able to say quite sincerely that it was the best years of his life. Why was that?
He'd grown up poor. And he was very impressed with how well the Americans treated him. He said the only time he was afraid was during the transport from Casablanca to the US because there were stories of U-boats sinking those transport ships. But he said that the GIs were all really nice to them, would share their chocolate and cigarettes with the prisoners. He was conscripted into the military in the first place. And so he was an unwilling combatant. And so he was just as glad as he could be that being captured by the British and given to the Americans was a pretty good outcome as far as he was concerned.
Tom, do you have anything to add?
Well, and in fact, just a little bit to add, that's a pretty accurate description. My father said that they knew that there was no way that Italy was going to be victorious if this country can capture them in North Africa and bring them all the way to the US. The resources that they had, there was no way that the Allies were going to be anything but victorious. But you're right, Perry, when you were saying that they were, not every POW can say that was the best years of their life. And there were some other Italian POWs that didn't fare as well as our fathers did. But I think our fathers had the advantage of being in an environment of the military was how do I say, they were very friendly to us, but to them. But also the Italian community was so vibrant in Southern California that
Yeah,
they
you're
were
right.
almost going home, and they could speak. Now, remember, my father couldn't speak English when he was a POW. And as we were talking earlier, it's, you're in your 20s and now your freedom is taken away and you're told what to do. And as Perry pointed out, that was a very dangerous voyage because of the German Wolfpack submarines that were attacking any Allied ships that were crossing. They wouldn't have known if it was prisoners or not. But the Perry did point out one thing: the German prisoners were treated much differently than the Italian prisoners were. And the threat of escape with the Italian prisoners was almost non-existent. German, a different story altogether.
Yeah.
So one of the things we want to point out during that era is that most of the men were in the military and were overseas. So there was really a labor shortage in the Inland Empire. So that's why they were having your fathers work in the fields, right?
Yes, and honestly, as we said earlier, it would have been against, I believe it would have been against the Geneva Convention if they would have been forced to work at an aircraft factory or making bombs or whatever. But the agriculture didn't hurt, it was pretty passive.
So Perry, what do you know about a typical day for a Camp Ono detainee? And I think that evolved as the war progressed.
It did. The camp was set up to repair vehicles and make and repair tents. And so I know that many of them were involved in that. Actually, my dad actually worked in the office of the camp. They had asked, when he was brought to the camp, they asked if any of them knew how to type. And my dad said that he did, which was a lie, but he got a job in the office and he taught himself how to type overnight that night. And he ended up being a very fast one-finger typist, but that's how he got a job in the office. Other things that they did for the camp, when I was a resident physician, that our food service manager had been a guard at the camp, and he told us lots of stories about how they interacted with the prisoners. And for example, when they were building the roads up the mountains to Big Bear, many of the prisoners worked on those mountain roads. And he told us that he would get a busload of prisoners. And because he was required to be armed, they would give him a pistol with one bullet. And they would go spend the day supervising prisoners building the roads up there. They did a lot of different things. And then on the weekends, of course, they had some entertainment activities. They could, with an American, they could leave the camp. A lot of Italian families, I know Tom will tell you this, a lot of Italian families would take prisoners home and give them a dinner or something like that. My dad met my mom because she was in the San Bernardino High School orchestra that came to the camp to play. And they had dances at the camp periodically. And so that's how Dad met Mom. So they had a pretty wide social life. They had a soccer team that used to play some of the San Bernardino soccer teams. Some of the prisoners were in the Civic Light Opera of San Bernardino. So they had a lot of integration with the community.
So Tom, what did your dad talk about with regard to what his days were like at the camp?
Sure. Unlike Perry's dad, my father didn't know how to type either, but his background was in agriculture. So they would furlough the fellows out to work on the ranches around in that area, the vineyards and so forth. And that's how he met my mom. He went to my grandfather's ranch and worked there. And that's how the spark started between the two of them. And yes, and by the way, Perry, I didn't know that's how your mom and dad met. I didn't realize she went to San Bernardino High School. But anyways, and they would go to the dances at the camp on, I believe it was Saturday nights. And then as opposed to working on anything. He would go work on the ranch and pretty much stay there. And of course, he would return to the camp at night, but that was his during the day. And the camp really, from where my grandfather's ranch, I'm going to say it was probably because it was in Vermont, and you would go up Palm up toward the foothills. So he was probably only about 5 miles from the camp was only about 5 miles from my grandfather's ranch.
So these dances, I mean, that didn't sound much like a prisoner of war camp, but Tom, you and I have talked previously. I asked if there were ever any Italian prisoners who wanted to escape. And what did you say?
Nobody was going to escape, but what I said was, where are we going to go that's better than this? That is what the Italians thought at that time. So, I mean, they had not complete freedom, don't get me wrong, but they were, you know, and Perry, the story that I heard was that the camp commander there for Camp Ono, his son had earlier been captured by the Italians in Europe, and he was treated very, very fairly by the Italians, and so the commander was basically reciprocating that treatment to these prisoners as well. But you know, their war was over. They knew it, and they were seeing the American life. And let me tell you, it was something that made an impression on them immediately. And it could have been a lot worse, but they certainly made the most of it. And you're right. The common thread was we might have lost the war, but we really won our new life.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, I understand that. A couple of things. One, the prisoners were basically wearing GI uniforms with the patch that said Italy on it, and that was the only thing that really distinguished them from appearance-wise from the GIs. And a lot of them used to walk into town and go somewhere and get a drink and things like that. And the fellow who was a guard, he said that they knew that they were leaving the camp, but he said as long as they showed up for roll call in the morning, nobody really cared. And I'd heard also that a few of the prisoners actually had cars. Now they obviously couldn't keep them at camp, but some of the families in the area would keep the cars for them. And then they'd leave camp and a bunch of them go and get in the car and drive into San Bernardino for one thing or another. So they had a great deal of flexibility. As a matter of fact, one of my dad's side responsibilities at the camp was to drive the commander's wife to downtown San Bernardino to go shopping. So he learned his way around San Bernardino by driving her around to do her shopping.
Well, talk about an in, right? That's probably because he worked in the office, right? He was.
Well, yes, and he'd been a driver for some officer when he was in Italy also. So he had some experience doing that. I guess not all of the prisoners knew how to drive a vehicle either. And so, but I knew that Dad knew how to drive because he used to, as a kid, he used to steal cars and joyride in Turin with his friends, and that's how he learned how to drive.
The statute of limitations run on that, so we're okay.
Yeah, right.
You know, one other thing to remember, Chuck, by 1944, Italy, they were no longer really prisoners of war because Italy had surrendered, and they were not going to be repatriated back until the conclusion of the war in Germany. But so they were kind of in a little different position than what the German prisoners were. So our fathers were pretty much at that time, you know, to be repatriated back to Italy, because the war was over for them in that country. And I think that's part of the reason, that, Perry, that they had so much freedom. You know what I mean? That they really were POWs at that point in time. But yes, they were POWs, and yes, they were still responsible to the government. But and I'm going to say that happened in early 44. By the time they got to Camp Ono, I think Italy had already surrendered, I think.
Italy surrendered in September 43 is when Mussolini surrendered. So
because your fathers had such a positive experience of being in the United States, and they had met their future wives, they wanted to come back. And so they finally went. Tom, when did your dad and your mom come back to the United States?
Toward the end of 46, I'm going to say the beginning of 47, even though they were married, he wasn't a citizen, so they had to apply for citizenship and had to be sponsored. And that's where my mom's family, the Traina family, came in to really help my dad get to this country. They sponsored him. They took care of him when he. There were no programs that we have today where you just walk over the border and the government supports you. You had to be sponsored, you had to be taken care of for all your needs. And my mom's family and my grandfather, Vic, they were very gracious, and they made that happen. As a matter of fact, my father told my aunt, my mother's sister, about his brother in Sicily. And they started corresponding back and forth, and they were married in I'm going to say 1948. They got together and they were married. So 2 brothers married 2 sisters, and the Traina family brought them all over and sponsored them to get their citizenship here. So it was a great, where the government stopped, my grandfather took over.
Perry, how about you? How about your dad and mom?
Well, Mom went back to Italy in early 47. They got married in April, and I think they stayed there about 6 months because my mom was pregnant when they came back to the US, which I think was October or November of 47. So I tell people that although I was born in the US, I was made in Italy.
So now a whole new chapter starts for your parents. They got back to the United States. They had family support, and then they founded businesses, right? So Tom, let's start with you. Your dad formed a trucking company, right?
Right. As I mentioned, in the Air Force, he drove a truck, so that was his background as well as agriculture. But when he came to this country, my mom worked for Railway Express Agency. Railway Express Agency was the precursor to the United Parcel System. They would take packages and you'd go pick them up at the rail stations, and they had local trucks that delivered them. My dad went to work for the Santa Fe. And then they both worked in transportation for a number of years. And then in 1962, with 2 of my uncles, my Uncle John and my Uncle Charlie, they joined with my parents, and they bought a little truck line called Auto Fast Freight in 1962, February 12th of 62. And at that time, a truck line had it was licensed by the Public Utilities Commission, so you had rights or you had an authority to operate. And over the years, how you expanded was you bought additional authority from other truck lines, or you applied for authority and you could expand your operating territory. Well, that was all well and good until deregulation. But I will say from those original 1962 until we closed in 1996, they went from 5 trucks to we had well over 300 pieces of equipment and 400 employees in 6 terminal locations. So, fast forwarding, a lot of hard work and a lot of good people along the way, and they were able to create. And by the way, part of the reason my father wanted to start a business so that his family could have a job and wouldn't have to go ask somebody for another job, because he knew how hard it was to get jobs for Italians at that time. So that's kind of the direction that we went in there. And I can't minimize the importance that my grandfather, Vic Traina, had an influence, as well as my mother and father, the hard work they put together.
Yeah. Now, Perry, your dad founded an electrical contracting business, right, in Rialto.
Well, when he first came to the U.S., Dad got a job at Santa Fe also. Worked in the as an electrician in the repair shops there at Santa Fe. And he also didn't get his citizenship until the early 50s. Then around 56, 57, he decided he wanted to have his own business. And so he switched over to work night shift at Santa Fe and started doing electrical work on his own during the daytime. And he did that for a couple years. And then by the late 50s, he was busy enough with his own electrical business that he stopped working at Santa Fe, took his contractor test, and started his own business. We moved to Rialto in 1958, and we lived there the rest of his life, and that was where his business was based. He worked all over San Bernardino, Fontana, the whole area.
So it was called Perry's Electric, right?
Perry's Electric, and his logo was a little devil because that reflected Dad's personality.
I remember seeing those vehicles around town. So they were well established. I remember hearing Zig Ziglar, a motivational speaker, say that immigrants were 5 times more likely to succeed in the United States because they did not take their opportunities for granted. Would you say that's true about your fathers? And Tom, you can answer first.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think that's why, probably in Perry's case too, that my father never wanted to go back to Italy. This was his home, and the opportunities here were here by far exceeded. Other than my one uncle who came over, as I'd mentioned, who married my mom's sister, it worked for him very well. But his other 2 brothers, they didn't want to leave Italy. They had not experienced the U.S. and they were like ducks out of water when they came here to visit. So it worked for them. It doesn't work for everybody, but it definitely worked for my father and my uncle. And they always appreciated this country, and they couldn't believe anyone who disrespected the flag, who disrespected how much that sacrifice that their generation had, the U.S., the Americans fighting the war so that everyone could be free. What is it they say that your fathers, your grandfathers fight wars so that so their sons can be truck drivers, so their sons can be doctors and lawyers, so their sons can be actors and so forth. And it really, they had a lot going, and they just loved America.
Perry, what do you have to add to that?
Tom is exactly right. Dad was always effusive in his praise for the opportunities that the U.S. presented to him, and he really was very critical of people who didn't take advantage of those opportunities because there were so many, and the U.S. had been so generous to him. So Tom's exactly right. Dad was an only child and brought his parents here to the U.S. in the mid-50s. So we didn't have any other relations in Italy on Dad's side at all that I've ever been able to have contact with. But there was never any thought about potentially going back. And Tom mentioned this, and I think he's really right. Italy had been hit hard economically by the war, and it took a long time for Italy to come back from that.
So Tom, you talked about future generations, descendants of your fathers. So both of you were very successful in what you did. So Tom, you eventually took over and ran the trucking company, right? And then
as time went on, and my parents, my mother unfortunately had macular degeneration, and she lost her eyesight. She started losing her eyesight when she was in her 50s. So she pretty much retired fairly young. And my dad, as he got on in years, he always wanted to go back to agriculture. So we ended up getting a ranch in Northern California, and he spent a lot of time on that. In the meantime, we ran the truck lines down here, which at one time we had 3 truck lines, auto fast freight. best delivery service in Western cargo carriers. So yes, went on to that, and it was very challenging. As I'd mentioned earlier, we closed in '96 when we realized that the capital investment to take it to the next level was, just a little bit much, and more than we wanted to bite off at the times of our life. So we were able to exit at that point in time in '96, and moved here to Arizona about 2 years later. So and that's where I ended up.
Now, first of all, both of you guys went to Aquinas High School in San Bernardino, and that's where I became aware of both of you. But Perry, you went on and continued with your education, and you became a physician. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, medicine had been my career path from early on. I know that Dad was probably a little disappointed that I didn't stay in town and take over his business, but I know both my parents were very pleased that I had become a doctor. Mom was disappointed that I never practiced in Rialto, so that she could tell everybody about her son, the doctor, if they're in town. Most of my career was, well, I started out practicing with the National Health Service Corps in Barstow. So I had my time there in the Southern California desert. But most of my career was teaching and training family medicine residents. I established several programs. I worked in training programs from California to Connecticut. And then in 1999, I took a position with the National Academy of Family Physicians and worked there until I retired in 2017. So I did a lot of different things over the years. My parents, I think they were disappointed I didn't practice there in Rialto, but I think they were always pleased that I had gone ahead and done something like I chose.
So do you think that your parents' work ethic influenced you to be focused and to achieve in the ways you did?
Who's first?
Tom.
Without a doubt. Their philosophy was always, you need to earn it. If you want it, go to work. That way you'll appreciate it. Roll up your sleeves and get the job done. Yes. I'm not saying they didn't get help along the way, but they had a very strong work ethic, and it definitely went to us. And you and I were chatting. You said, "Well, when did you go and join your dad in the business?" And I mentioned I can't remember not being in the business, even from 1962. As kids, we would work, and there's another story behind that. But we worked. Summers were spent working. I would ride with truck drivers. I would be a swamper, working on the docks and learning how to drive a truck, and finally getting my commercial license. But yeah, and by the way, Chuck, it worked out real well because I hated school. So to have a job really was fortunate. But yes, I did go on to additional education. But as I'd mentioned, some of the best times of my life were driving a truck. I enjoyed it. But get back to your original question. Yes, our parents' work ethic was definitely impressed on us, and I'd hope to think we impressed it on our children as well.
So Perry, how about you?
Well, the work ethic was impressed sometimes more than I wanted. I remember being out there in Southern California summer, wiring houses when I was 10 years old. And because I was working with Dad and I was small, I was the guy who got the job of crawling in the attic or crawling under the house to run wires and stuff. So yeah, I remember the work ethic very clearly, and it certainly served me well, no question about it.
Well, anything else you would like to share about Camp Ono that we haven't covered here? Perry, how about you? I know you've been contacted previously by different reporters and also representatives from the Army Corps of Engineers about Camp Ono.
Yeah, the camp has a very interesting history. The information about the camp is very spotty. I shared a lot of my resources with the Army Corps of Engineers when they were investigating the allegation that the camp had somehow contaminated the aquifer in that area. And it turned out that it wasn't the camp that had done so. It was a business that had come after the camp was there. But I shared some photographs with them that they didn't have. They shared some documents from the camp that I didn't have. So it's interesting to have an operation that was that busy and involved with the community, and yet the resources of information about it were so limited. As you said, Chuck, a lot of the people in San Bernardino hardly even knew that there was a camp there, except maybe among the Italian community that had more contact with the prisoners.
Anything to add to
that? You know, I was listening, you know, Perry, part of that I think was there was so much going on at that time in the 40s. And I don't think they were really concerned about that camp to be keeping a lot of records at. But you know, Chuck, when you called me, I'd not forgotten it. It'd been in the back of my mind. And I really hadn't thought about it for a long time. I can remember as a kid going from where we lived in San Bernardino to my grandfather's ranch and going out Kendall. And in the 50s, the buildings were still there. The barracks were still standing, and some of them had fallen down, but the foundations were still there as well. So I can remember seeing it.
Well, if I can sound like I'm patronizing you, I think that your parents would be very proud of you. And I know that you've all been successful enough in your adult lives to where they were able to see some of that. And thank goodness your fathers came to the Inland Empire because they made a difference. They built thriving businesses that serviced a lot of people, impacted a lot of people, created a lot of jobs. So that's a wonderful thing. Well, thank you both for joining us for this episode of I Remember the Inland Empire. And hopefully as a result of this program, more people will become aware of Camp Ono and also the amazing stories of your fathers.
Thank you, Chuck, for bringing us together.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for keeping up the story.
Today's program was produced by Mike Kunert. Thanks for everybody for watching.